And I left the radio on yesterday in Galatians 2 and verse number 11. But when Peter was come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face, because he was to be blamed. All right, our question is, why is Peter to be blamed? Well, Paul tells us that in verse 12. For before that certain came from James, he did eat with the Gentiles. But when they were come, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing them which were of the circumcision. Now, I'll spend some time developing verse number 12 on the broadcast. I may be able to get to it before the end of this week. If not, we'll try to develop those things on next week. Paul's rebuke of Peter is over the area of the law. The law here is the law of a dietary law, the law of eating. Peter is just never, over the course of his ministry, Peter never seems to quite be able to get away from the matter of Mosaic law. That's why I think Paul identified that unto Peter was committed the gospel of the circumcision, whereas Paul was committed the gospel of the uncircumcision. It's matters just exactly like we find here in Galatians chapter number 2, like we find in Acts 10 with the vision of the sheep. Peter says, not so, Lord, for I've never eaten anything common or unclean. He tells the Lord, no, I'll not do it. The Lord gives him a commission. Rise, Peter, kill and eat. Peter's reply is, I'll not do it. I'm a good Jew. I'll not do it. Now, I pointed out on the program yesterday that there are men and movements that have to come to Peter's defense in this. There are some writers that deny that this is Peter altogether. They say that this is another Peter mentioned in the Bible. Some of the ancient translations translate the name Cephas rather than Petros, as it is here in the passage. They alter it to Cephas so that they can say, well, this is a different Cephas and not the same Cephas, and to appropriate this to Peter is in error. Then the Roman Catholic Church has a dilemma because of their theory, their doctrine of the infallibility of the Pope. But if the Pope is infallible, why is Peter being rebuked by the Apostle Paul? He is being corrected by Paul, and the papacy has some difficulty, so obviously the passage must be altered in the Douay Rheims translation, and then the NIV and the other various modern translations. They must run to Peter's defense because Peter is the first pope according to them, and the Pope is infallible, when obviously the plain reading of these passages would present to you and me something quite different than what is presented and promoted by the papacy. But when Peter was come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face, because he was to be blamed. Now, this visit of Peter to Antioch is sometime after the Jerusalem Council. I'm not prepared to try to tell how many days, how many months, maybe a year had gone by. I'm not certain. That there's nothing plain in the passage to give a timeline to me concerning this. But it is after the Jerusalem Council that Peter makes apparently another visit, because Paul says, for before that certain came from James, in verse number 12, so obviously this was not Peter's first visit to the churches that are in the regions of Galatia. But on this particular visit, Peter apparently is not alone. Peter has brought a group of men, a group of the brethren from James, and desiring to save face among them, desiring to maintain his position among the legalists that were in the kingdom church that is there in Jerusalem. Peter now offends the Gentiles by refusing to have a meal with them. Paul says, but that I withstood, but when Peter was come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face. This Greek word, withstood, is the Greek word anistomai. Anistomai is used by the Apostle Paul 8 times in the Pauline epistles. anistemi. In Romans 9:19, for who hath resisted his will? Romans 13:2, resisteth the ordinance of God. In Romans 13 and verse number 2 again, that resist shall receive. In Galatians 2:11, withstood him to the face, which would be my text. In Ephesians 6:13, able to withstand in the evil day. 2 Timothy 3 and verse number 8, Jannes and Jambres withstood Moses. In 2 Timothy 3:8, do these also resist? Do these also resist the truth? Do resist. In 2 Timothy 4 and verse number 15, he hath greatly withstood our words. He hath greatly withstood our words. When Peter arrived, Paul withstands him, but when Peter was come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face. And that carries with it the fact that Paul was in opposition to him. Paul resisted what Peter had done. It is to resist the actions of one or to stop the course or the progress of one, preventing them from reaching or their goal or penetrating. Here are the Galatian believers, and of course they're Gentiles, and the law, Mosaic law, was never given to the Gentile. There is no application of the matter of Mosaic law in any part of the Scripture to the Gentile people. They're Gentiles that have placed themselves under the law, but the Gentiles had no priesthood, sacrificial system. The Gentiles had no temple. They had no brazen altar. There's no place where God ever divided the Gentile peoples up into 12 tribes like he did his own. Not at all. The Galatians, who have no understanding of the matter of Mosaic law, they don't come from a background of sacrifices and rites and ceremonies. They don't come from a background that has a religious, a ritualistic religious practice. All of these things are foreign to them. All they know, just like Gentile believers do today, is that I once was lost, but now I'm found. I was blind, but now I see. All they know is I was a miserable sinner, but now I'm saved. All they understood was the saving grace of God. All they understood was the fact of the substitutionary sacrificial death of Jesus Christ on their behalf to save them from their sin. They have no concept of clean and unclean meats. They have no concept of days and years. They have no concept of touch not, taste not, handle not. They're not involved in those matters. So for Peter to draw such a distinction when he had eaten with them previously, but now because he has a battery of men that have come with him from the kingdom church in Jerusalem, legalists, if you please, men that are still attempting, Judaizers that are attempting to incorporate the matter of the law back into the preaching of the grace of God. The Galatians remember that the last time Peter was here to preach, he freely sat down and ate with us and freely had fellowship with us. And yet he's come this time and with these men that have accompanied him, and he refuses to have a meal with us. He refuses to sit down and eat with us. He will not partake with us. He won't have a meal with us. This causes them a tremendous area of confusion. One thing that Paul the Apostle points out is God is not the author of confusion. I have seen many times where such confusion, religious and theological confusion, would be promoted and presented that there's no way the hand of God and the power of God could be in such confusion as that. I have been in meetings before in years gone by where I would hear 3 or 4 preachers preach in the morning session, and when you walked out the side door of the meeting house or the campground or wherever it might have been, you had 4 or 5 different ways to be saved, or 4 or 5 different ways to know whether or not you're saved. And I've been in meetings where year after year we see the same people go to the altar and make a new profession of faith. That is nothing but confusion. God is not the author of confusion, but of peace. When Peter desired to be excused from eating with the Gentiles on this second go-around in Galatia, Paul refused to comply with him. Paul was not going to give him license to do that. He refused to comply with the weakness of Peter, because there's a battery of men that have gathered together from Jerusalem. There's a battery of men here that are under the matter of Mosaic law. And because Peter's desiring to maintain his position in good standing with the law and with the church at Jerusalem, he refuses to eat with the Gentiles. That is his weakness. It is Peter's weakness in returning to the law. Paul refused to comply with that. And Paul offered resistance to Peter. Peter, I don't know what words were exchanged, but Peter might have said, "Now, if you don't mind, we'll go down to the K&W and we'll have dinner at the cafeteria. And then we'll be back this afternoon to preach in the afternoon service." And Paul refused to comply with that. He would not put his stamp of approval on that. He said, "No, the ladies of our church have prepared a meal in the fellowship hall, and we're going to the fellowship hall to eat, and you're going to the fellowship hall, and everybody that came with you, you're going to the fellowship hall to eat with us." Now, why would Paul do that? Paul is not trying to be obstinate for the sake of being obstinate, not at all. But Paul is offering this resistance for the sake of the Gentile believers that were in Galatia. You see, Peter's withdrawal of himself, Peter's legalistic vacillating back and forth. See, the last time he came, he ate freely with them. This time, he'll not eat with them at all. And these legalistic vacillations back and forth were a source of confusion for the Gentile believers. They're scratching their heads. They don't have a legal understanding. The brazen altar has very little meaning to them. The Levitical priesthood has very little meaning to them. And they are in a state of confusion, not understanding. Why would Peter eat with us last time, but he won't eat with us this time? And for the sake of these believers, Paul withstands Peter to the face. Now, by the grace of God, I'll continue with this on the broadcast tomorrow. I hope you'll be listening at that time.
Box 4, Greenville, South Carolina 29602. Visit the website at